The Ministry of Timelines bears no official responsibility for the content of this research. We conclude that the purge of Pythria was a pivotal branch point in the Belbos timeline. Advise further examination of the slaughter on Pythria. This will be necessary to achieve a complete view of this timeline. What really drove the hegemony into such drastic action? The TSS Lagrange was not the first human starship to leave the Sol system, nor was it the most advanced. But on April 11, 2200, the science ship Lagrange was the first manned ship to travel into the depths of space at the instruction of a human government and flying a human flag. For generations, Alpha Centauri, the closest star system to Earth, had remained just out of reach for humanity. But with the new freedoms bequeathed by an alien emperor, the trinary star system that had inspired human imagination for so long was entered and explored. The survey of Alpha Centauri revealed a vast system filled with untapped potential, and amongst the new worlds, a mystery was uncovered. Alpha Centauri 5 was a desolate world and, to the scientists that surveyed the planet Shock, was locked into a bleak, nuclear winter. The survey team found no natural causes for the high levels of radiation detected on the world they called Nadam. Further examination would be required to illuminate this enigma. Regarded as the greatest discovery, however, was a planet capable of sustaining human life. On Earth, the celebration at this news was tinged with unease. The satrap used Nadam to show that the Belbos were utterly correct to invade Earth, that the human race had stood on the brink of nuclear self-annihilation, and without their parental guidance, humanity would now be extinct. As the Sol Satrapy took its first official steps into a vast unknown galaxy, their neighbours, their siblings under Belbos, the Inac Satrapy, made their first unsupervised contact with Earth. Both nations were painfully aware that humans were responsible for their subjugation and inclusion into the hegemony. This meant that the Bronterok's clumsy attempts at diplomacy were overly indulged by Earth. Had the Bronterok of Inac been more familiar with human communication, their behaviour would have been considered rude and completely inexcusable. Had the humans understood the Bronterok better, their hostile intentions would have been clear. At the decree of the satrap Geoffrey Hammond, the supreme military governor of the human race, an emergency shift in the economic policy of Earth was undertaken. His government embarked on a spending program of titanic proportions as an emergency colonization project began, and resources were poured into the construction of a gigantic colony ship. Publicly, official news outlets spoke of settling the new world discovered in Alpha Centauri to safeguard the interests of Earth and Belbos. Within the court of the satrap, it was thought that even if the hegemony took back the freedoms they had recently bestowed, the human race would never again be trapped on a single planet. As part of this intense spending campaign, the slums of Earth were cleared. Their populations pressed into working the new factories and shipyards. The new colony was not the only priority of the satrapy, as, alongside the colonization efforts, much of the increased industrial output was diverted to the navy and used to build warships, for the protection of Earth and the hegemony they served. On June 6, 2203, the aptly named TSS Unity touched down on the virgin world of Alpha Centauri 3, ever after called New Netherlands, proudly named in honour of one of the preeminent naval powers of old Earth. The colonists on this world carried the hopes and dreams of all those they had left behind on Earth. Many hoped for a fresh start away from the ever-watchful eyes of the hegemony of Belbos. Unfortunately, the gaze of Belbos would not be so easily obscured, and representatives from the Hegemony were already waiting on the planet when the colony ship touched down. The emergency project to colonize a new planet left the economy of Earth on the brink of total collapse. In order to prevent these spiraling deficits running out of control, the government, at the behest of its aristocratic court, searched for aid from the other satrapies of the Hegemony. The Imperial Razax estate, a legally separate prefecture and most ancient of the Hegemony's children, was more than happy to help the beleaguered governments of Earth. Not well versed in imperial diplomatic protocol and unaware of the reputation or nature of the estate, the Sol Satrapy struck a Faustian bargain. The human diplomats, who were in reality admirals of the navy, were entirely taken in by the gregarious promises of the plebals. The estate would step in to guarantee Earth's national debt for a very modest fee. Buried deep in the fine print, the plebals included an abhorrent schedule of mounting payments, well outside the value of any assistance given to humanity. In 2206, riding high on the apparent influx of riches from the trade deal, the corrupt elites used tax money to fund new and expanded noble estates. Tax money that should have been spent on increasing refined alloy production, essential for the construction of warships, was instead spent on building lavish palaces for the already ludicrously wealthy. The Admiralty protested fiercely against this misappropriation of state resources, but their protestations fell on decadent, deaf ears. Only 4 months after the payments from the Imperial Razax estate had begun, they dried up. Plebal lawyers and accountants descended on the earth. They pulled out arcane references from the Hegemony's great texts, the parent protocols, that showed that the estate had no further obligation to continue payments to humanity. The trickle of assistance dried up. The markets crashed. For the satrapy was still obliged to hold up their end of the agreement. Reparations to the estate were due. Defaulting on payments would constitute a breach of the parent protocols and draw the ire of Belbos. During these times of economic hardship, many humans decided to try out for a better life not on the new colonies of the satrapy, but instead on the capital worlds of the Hegemony, to live with Belbos visible in the sky. These economic migrants fled Earth by the million. After almost 5 years of research and investigation, the mystery of Nadam became a little less opaque. The research team discovered that this planet was a tomb. Thousands of years ago, the entire surface was subjected to an assault by low-yield nuclear warheads, seemingly designed to create as much radioactive fallout as possible, with the intended purpose of sterilizing this planet of life. Whilst this process was successful, organic compounds were found deep in caves underneath the surface. In one shocking discovery, scientists came across the remnants of organisms with surprisingly similar markers to DNA from life on Earth. This discovery led to more questions than it answered, and its legitimacy was questioned. Did humans once walk these worlds? Were these some distant cousins to humanity? Or perhaps did a scientist simply forget to clean their shoes? The mystery deepened 1 year later in 2208, when scientists working in the nearby Philomere system discovered a second world blanketed by radioactive fallout. On Hasara, they ascertained that roughly 750,000 years ago, this planet was annihilated. The biosphere was completely destroyed in an eerily similar way to Nadam. However, on this world, human archaeologists would get a lucky break. An underground bunker was uncovered. Within this sealed complex, protected from the nuclear winter raging above, well-preserved bodies were found. Though clearly alien, these corpses shared an uncomfortably large number of traits with humanity. And as far as the archaeologists could tell, if it weren't for the 6th digit at the end of each limb, their skeletons looked human. What little DNA that could be extracted from the aliens showed that they shared a common evolutionary history with humanity. Perhaps they even evolved on the same world eons ago. Whilst the findings on both of these tomb worlds were revolutionary, they were not made publicly available. Instead, they were hidden deep within the archives of the Navy's Exploration Division on the orders of the Satrap, and further travel to or investigation of Hasara and Nadam was banned. In 2213, the Navy encountered alien life which was, worryingly, completely unknown and undocumented by their overlords on Belbos. Under a cautious policy of first contact, humanity tried to extend a hand in friendship. Sadly, they were greeted with only violence and death from the aliens. When human ships started being lost on the edge of Satrapy territory, they were written off as unfortunate accidents in the depths of space, until, finally, an escape pod was recovered with a lone human survivor. She painted a grim picture of the carnage wrought by this new alien threat, how they had encountered her vessel, a simple, unarmed construction ship on a peaceful mission to a distant star, how the humans had tried in vain to communicate with the strange tree-like alien vessels whose branches dwarfed their ship, but with no success. How the alien vessel attacked. It overwhelmed their shields, crippled their engines, and then its root-like protrusions extended out to entangle the human ship. The strange, plant-like aliens, who were almost miniature versions of their ship, then boarded the vessel, rounded up the crew, and began to experiment on the humans, not even bothering to take them back onto the alien ship. The humans were killed, one by one, in the most excruciating of ways, generally involving a final autopsy on a still living being, kicking and screaming on what had, until recently, been a dinner table. Finally, after their gruesome task was complete, the aliens departed. Had she not been deep inside the ship's bowels, repairing their nuclear drive, she would have been found and killed alongside the rest of the crew. Unable to pilot the entire vessel alone, she abandoned ship, being careful to bring the essential data from this first contact. On the opposite side of human space, the fleets of the Satrapy were busy participating in a grand reenactment of the welcome ceremony of the Bronterok people, on the 35th anniversary of the Hegemony invasion of Great Nest. At the behest of the Hegemony, the human ships even conducted live-fire drills, much to the distaste of the human admiralty. Inac-Sol relations fell to new lows. The Navy began establishing a spy network in the Inac Satrapy, mindful of the reaction that their inflammatory and unnecessary display above Great Nest may have aroused. With the majority of the Sol Satrapy's fleets occupied in the Inac system, it would take almost a year for the human navy to respond properly to the hostile intent of the unknown aliens at humanity's borders. A hastily assembled gathering of Darker-class destroyers and Florida-class corvettes was dubbed the Periclean Expedition. Commanded by Admiral Jalaya Bakir, they finally tracked down the elusive alien threat in the Ferre system. For the first time, the Navy was able to test their weaponry, tactics, and defences against a hostile force of equivalent technological prowess. The news of great victories was broadcast on Earth as they destroyed a few small and lightly armed observation outposts and alien mining operations. The public rejoiced. Admiral Bakir and her officers tempered their enthusiasm, acutely aware that the Navy had not managed to find or engage any of the alien ships that had raided human space. Destroying a few small outposts was not the same as defeating an entire fleet of warships. After almost a year of fighting, in 2218, communications were finally established with the enemy. Terrifyingly for the satrapy, the aliens were completely unknown to the Belbos, who were themselves indifferent to the threat, as they were not a child of ours. The Rahetan entity was not a single species, an entire planet alive and somehow working in concert. From the smallest single-cellular organisms and up to the gigantic tree-like structures that sprouted from the surface, they were all a part of the same collective intent. The closest analogy that human scientists could draw upon was a colony of ants, each ant individually devoid of consciousness, but together able to function and behave as a much more complex entity. Concepts like borders, war, and reparations were strange to the Rahetan entity, but human diplomats, backed up by the threat of Navy weaponry, managed to explain the idea of a closed border. Incursions into human space ceased, but humanity remained vigilant in the face of this truly alien threat. In 2220, human explorers discovered an alien species named the Matok in the Othana system. They used crude alloy-based weapons and tools, had basic governmental structures, and a low population. To draw an analogue to humanity's technological development, the Matok appeared to be in the late Iron Age. Within days of this discovery, the Belbos contacted Earth. The Sol Satrapy would be responsible for the care and protection of the Matok, until such a time as they were ready to join the Hegemony, for they too were the children of Belbos and had a destiny written in the parent protocols. Given the abrupt nature of the Belbos communication, questions were raised about the informational security of the Navy. How had they known about the Matok before even the satrap of Earth? Human interstellar technology was, after all, based on hegemony design. Clearly, their surveillance project was much more extensive than humanity knew. 1 year later, Admiral Fred Phillips and Admiral Jalaya Bakir were called to Belbos. Along with a small cadre of other officers, they were brought before the Emperor. The supreme ruler of the hegemony decreed that the Sol Military Satrapy had failed in their holy mission. Humanity had not protected their siblings, the Matok. Humanity had not safeguarded the interests of the hegemony. Humanity had failed. The Emperor revealed images taken from the Othana system. As the Earth had been busy forming a task force to occupy the Othana system and fortify it, the unthinkable had happened. The images showed an alien armada entering the system, taking up position around the Matok's world and invading the planet. Horrific footage from the surface showed the devastation wrought by the invaders. After millions of Matok were dead, they were then pressed into slavery, forced to strip mine their world of precious ore and resources. These images, and the Emperor's audience with the admirals, was broadcast across the hegemony. The magnitude of Earth's failure was shocking. Emperor Shaddam proclaimed that failure would not be tolerated. The delegation present would serve as an example to the rest of humanity. They would be sentenced to death. Unwavering in their loyalty, Admiral Fred Phillips and the others saluted. Their cry of "Praise Belbos" echoed around the chamber as they were vaporized. The transmission from Belbos ceased. On Earth and her colonies, the people were shocked. The court of the satrap used this situation to end the human freedom of movement to the core worlds of the hegemony, stemming the flood of wealthy human migrants that had been leaving Earth since 2206. For the Navy, the execution of Fred Phillips was a turning point. Serious questions were asked at the highest levels. Faith and loyalty in Belbos were shaken. In an attempt to prevent such a situation repeating itself without any warning, the Admiralty began to establish a covert intelligence gathering operation on the Imperial capital. After years of migration, many humans were now in an excellent position to join such an operation, and with the sudden execution of the human admirals, many did. It was through this network of informants on the Imperial capital that the name Pythria first gained human attention. In 2224, the Imperial Razak's estate presented the Navy with a choice. Either the Admiralty could begin paying a subscription fee and receive access to the information from the estate's clandestine operatives on Inac, or the clumsy human attempts at espionage would be revealed. After extortionate payment was received, the estate revealed that the Inac satrapy had key information about the previous inhabitants of the radioactive tomb worlds Hasara and Nadam. For an additional fee, they would also begin to investigate further. 2 years later, the Periclean expedition arrived in the Othana system. The satrap hoped by fighting there and expelling the alien occupation forces, they might win back the favour of Belbos. After heavy protestations from the Admiralty, the expedition engaged the aliens. A short campaign against a much smaller force yielded victory for the Navy. Marines were dropped onto the surface of the Matok world, overrunning the local defences and securing the planet. The satrap reported their success to the Emperor, hoping to gain favour. Sadly, his hopes were short-lived. An undersecretary for the Belbos diplomatic mission on Earth informed the satrap that as the Matok had been enslaved, colonised and generally contaminated, the experiment was now deemed a failure. And that meant that the Matok were now worthless and should be discarded at the earliest opportunity. They were now an irrelevance to the hegemony and the Emperor. The Navy should leave the animals to their new alien masters. With that, the Periclean expedition was ordered to withdraw from Othana. A warship had been lost, and thousands of humans had died, so that Geoffrey Hammond could play at court politics in the hegemony. Resentment was reportedly coming to a boiling point amongst the fleet's cadre of officers. Back on Earth, there was an eruption of social disturbances. Mass protests filled the cities. They spread like a fungus across the capital and the colonies. Armed with the phrase, "Fred died, Belbos lied." Monuments were defaced and the economic heart of the satrapy ground to a halt. Even though the majority of these protests were entirely non-violent, the government's response was swift and brutal. Following the strict doctrine of Belbos, once initial law enforcement attempts by the Peace Corps proved ineffective at dispersing the dissidents, the military was deployed to stamp out the insurrection. Thousands were killed, and millions that joined the protests were rounded up and sentenced to a lifetime of hard labour. Uttering or transcribing the phrase, "Fred died, Belbos lied," became an offence. Those that were guilty would have their little finger removed. This archaic punishment allowed the offenders to complete their assigned manual labour, despite being deformed. Though the satrapy restored order, many lost all love for Belbos. In order to display their displeasure and identify others that were like-minded, a secret hand gesture emerged. The three-finger salute showed support and solidarity for the anti-Belbos movement, without risking the loss of your own finger. Alongside this salute, a new fashion emerged. A three-fingered glove showed your allegiance to the movement. However, this did not last long, as across the satrapy, the style of a three-fingered glove became common, perverted from its original intention. With social instability affecting human worlds, the court of the satrap elected to escalate a tense border situation with the Rehetan entity into open war. After a small border dispute near the Ferre system in 2231, the entire might of the Navy was unleashed. After the previous incursion over 10 years before, the entity had fortified its observation installations against further attack. But these defences were quickly swept aside as human ships began a long campaign into the very heart of Rehetan space, On Earth, propaganda declared this war was a very fight for the survival of the hegemony and the people of Earth. Privately, Belbos cared little for the actions of the Rahetan. In 2232, the Sol Satrapy was also forced to officially open its borders to the Inac Satrapy, who had been excluded after a minor terrorist incident by an apparent Bronteroc science vessel in the Sol system a decade before. The heavy hand of the hegemony was felt by the entire court of the satrap. Only a few months later, the estate presented irrefutable evidence to the Navy, collected by their covert operatives, that the Bronteroc had established a human prison world on the bleak and radioactive surface of a world deep within their space. Humans trapped on the human cage were being used for all manner of scientific experiments. In a knee-jerk response, all Bronteroc living in human space were stripped of their rights and resettled en masse to Hasara, which became known colloquially as the Bronteroc prison world. There can be little doubt that without the overbearing hand of the hegemony, open conflict between these two nations would have engulfed this area of the galaxy. Perhaps this was very lucky for humanity, as their fleets were busy prosecuting a war far away against the Rahetan entity. Human forces had occupied two worlds and were poised to invade their home planet, Rahetan. The aliens employed little in the way of tactics against the invasion forces, repeatedly using mass assaults in an attempt to stop the occupation of their worlds. Humans quickly realized that if they eliminated the largest of the Rahetan biological organisms, the great tree-like structures, the other Rahetan creatures in the local area would become aimless and passive. This knowledge was used to devastating effect on their homeworld, as the Navy preceded the landing of ground forces with a surgical orbital bombardment to remove the great trees. This reduced all other resistance by the entity to a non-issue. But the fall of their homeworld did not force an end to the war, as the court of the satrap had hoped. If anything, the entity was clearly enraged and clearly learning. In the Mugi system, it had laid a trap. The entity, which had displayed little in the way of tactics or strategy previously, lured the Royal Maiden fleet into the system and then ambushed them at the edge of a hyperlane emergence point. High above a gas giant, the two armadas clashed. Rahetan tree ships, giant organic behemoths, fired beam and particle weapons at the surprised human warships. The humans responded in kind with nuclear and kinetic assaults. A ferocious battle ensued. Had the Periclean expedition, led by Admiral Guy Gagny, not joined the fray, the Navy might have suffered their first defeat in Mugi. Meanwhile, the human operatives working on the Imperial capital in 2234 uncovered a vast collection of information on Pythria. Once the 6th satrapy of the hegemony, now nothing remains of their people. Great miners and craftsmen, they were brought into the fold to supply Belbos with raw materials. At some point in the last 100 years, Pythria fell out of favour. Tensions escalated between them and the hegemony. According to the records uncovered, they went against their parents' wishes again and again, until the Emperor decreed that the experiment with Pythria had failed, and they should be purged from existence. The exact crimes or methods used for the purging was not detailed, though a stellar location for Pythria was found. This information was then hidden by the Navy, under the strict orders of the court of the satrap. With the war against the Rahetan entity turning into a stalemate, positive news from the front all but dried up. In 2236, in an attempt to keep the populace from returning to the disorder of the past, the satrap began a campaign of broadcasting blanket coverage on the Inac satrapy. Detailed exposés on the tactical capabilities of Inac warships and the ease with which the Navy would defeat them were pushed on every media channel. Whilst this campaign did have the desired effect, it further stoked the public into an even greater anti-Bronterok sentiment. In 2240, Tar-Kadal, the tectonically unstable and overexploited home of an alien race on the western border of the Hegemony, exploded. Its eventual destruction had long been predicted by observers outside the insular Lycian utopia. Help and assistance was repeatedly offered by the Hegemony, but declined. There were no problems inside the Lycian utopia. The Lycians made no apparent efforts to evacuate their planet, meaning that, aside from a few scattered survivors in space, their entire civilization perished along with their homeworld. After 5 grueling years of war inside Rahetan Entity territory, and little gains on either side, the Navy managed to secure a new peace agreement. The entity would respect the new borders of the Sol Satrapy, containing 2 entity worlds and their original homeworld. Interestingly to the Navy negotiators, the entity held no particular sentiment for the world of its birth. Instead, it displayed pragmatism, choosing not to waste further resources fighting an unwinnable war in perpetuity. This peace was heralded as a great victory on every human world, a successful test of strength and of willpower. New human colonists were even brought to the 3 worlds now devoid of entity organisms. Following this peace, the Rahetan entity revealed the existence of many alien civilizations beyond the borders of Belbos, on the other side of entity space. The Black Dominion, the Nuta Archivists, and the Merakian Republic, and many, many more. A galaxy teeming with life. Against the Council of the Hegemony, the Sol Satrapy entered diplomatic relations with many of these aliens, even going so far as to allow free movement of sentience between the Nuta Archivists and the Satrapy. Belbos was displeased. But less than a year after their great victory over the Rahetan, the Emperor of the Hegemony, Shaddam VI, was dead. The circumstances surrounding his death on the capital were shrouded in the usual amount of Belbos mystery. But following his death were 2 significant events. The Tronzaru Continuum made contact with Earth. This ancient race of enigmatic machines informed humanity that they would be watching their progress, and at the insistence of the Belbos, would be administering a species-wide inoculation to remove widespread biological vulnerabilities in humanity. The second is that the unpopular Roderick ascended to the throne with the help of the military, much to the chagrin of the High Court of the Hegemony. The Hegemony then stopped responding to all communication from Earth. Their embassies were abandoned, the protective garrison was recalled, and news stopped flowing from the Imperial capital. Covert operatives still reporting on the capital told tales of civil disturbances and fighting across the Imperial Palace. What started on just the capital quickly spread to all the worlds of the Hegemony. Belbos fractured, as 8 separate claimants denied the legitimacy of Empress Roderick I's claim to the throne. Just before the Imperial Palace was destroyed by orbital bombardment, amongst the chaos, a covert Navy operative gained access to a secret Hegemony archive, the contents of which they tried to broadcast back to the Navy. Their transmission was garbled by the conflict, but emphasis was placed on a single word: Lupta. Without direct guidance from the Hegemony, the satrap floundered. His court, like the Hegemony, split in a myriad of different directions. Some suggested that the Navy should be deployed to aid the new Empress, or one of the other claimants that might win the day, in hope of gaining favour with the victor. Others counselled that the satrap should launch his own challenge to become the emperor. Amidst this turmoil, the Navy decided to take action. Sick of the dictatorship of the satrap and returning fresh from victory in the field, they would not sit idly by, but instead seize this opportunity. They stormed into the palace of the satrap, arresting him and all of the members of his court in attendance. With the previous administration imprisoned, Admiral Guy Gagny took on the role of interim president. In his first address to all citizens of the Sol Satrapy, Admiral Gagny announced the birth of a new nation. The Free Human Republic would hold its first free and fair election under the careful watch of Navy representatives. Many parties formed to compete in the election. The three largest of these, that between them held almost all of the seats in the new parliament, were the National Defence Party, keen supporters of the Navy, the Human Xeno Alliance, staunch believers that humanity would only prosper by working with others, and the Human Advancement Front. The HFA fell just short of achieving an outright majority, but with assurances from the two other major parties, formed a minority government. Admiral Gagny, the interim president, peacefully passed his powers to the leader of the HFA, President-elect Charlotte Foster. But what of the other satrapies and the civil war now burning across the stars? Would this fledgling republic survive the turmoil of its birth, or would the hegemony regain their supremacy over the people of Earth? This concludes our analysis of the Age of Subjugation for humanity in this timeline. Please refer to the next chapter of this report for further details on the Belbos timeline.